Easter Monday, the 28th of March, in the year 845. That is the day the world changed for the people of Paris, although none of them knew it when they woke. The Seine was running high with spring melt, and the dawn mist sat thick over the water like a held breath. You know the name of this siege. You have seen the paintings, the horned helmets, the burning ships, but you have no idea what really happened here. In the span of a single season, a fleet of Viking longships turned the heart of the Frankish kingdom into a treasure chest with a broken lock. The oars came first, slicing the fog in perfect rhythm. Hundreds of them, moving against the current with a patience that should have terrified every sentry on the walls. Then the hulls emerged, low and sleek, dragon prows gleaming with fresh paint and old blood, and the sound of them was the sound of 1,000 wolves breathing. This is the story of how a city paid a fortune to make the raiders go away. This is the story of the first time the word Danegeld meant something real. And by the time you understand the true weight of that silver, you will never look at the Viking Age the same way again. So sit down, pull your chair close, because what happened on that riverbank was not a battle won by heroes or a victory of civilization over savagery. It was a business deal, written in blood, sealed with gold, and it reshaped the future of Europe. By 9 in the morning, the mist had burned off, and Paris could see exactly what was coming up the river. Not one ship, not 10. A fleet so vast that it choked the Seine from bank to bank, the water disappearing beneath a moving forest of masts and carved timber. The defenders of Paris were no strangers to raiders. For years, the reports had trickled in from the coast, whispered tales of villages burned to ash, monasteries stripped of their relics, priests and peasants driven into the river to drown. But those were distant stories, the kind you hear over supper and forget by morning. This was the morning, and the story was no longer distant. It was standing in the shallows, dragging its ships onto the mud, and looking up at the city walls with the patient hunger of men who had sailed 1,000 miles for exactly this moment. If you have ever sat in traffic and watched the minutes bleed away, you know the particular frustration of being trapped by something you cannot outrun. Now imagine that trapped feeling stretched over an entire city, with the thing blocking your path being not a stalled truck, but an army of raiders who wanted everything you owned. The Franks had a choice in that moment, and choices have consequences that echo for centuries. They could fight, they could flee, or they could negotiate. And the man who had to make that choice was a king who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders while the river carried death toward his gates. Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, the giant who had once made all of Europe tremble at the name of the Franks. But giants cast long shadows, and Charles had spent his entire reign standing in his grandfather's. The kingdom he inherited was a patchwork of proud nobles, restless bishops, and ambitious kinsmen, all watching him for the first sign of weakness. And here, floating up the Seine like a bad omen, came the first test that mattered. The Viking leader in that season, the man who commanded this dragon fleet, was a figure whose name appears in the chronicles with a certainty that suggests he was no legend. Reginhirus, they called him, a warlord who understood something the Franks had forgotten. Reginhirus saw what the Franks had forgotten, and that one forgotten truth would crack an empire open. If you want to see the whole brutal chain of events unfold, subscribe right now, because what comes next is the moment everything changed. Drop the word Reginhirus in the comments if you've ever wondered what happens when a king faces a man who understands his kingdom better than he does. That understanding was simple. The wealth of the Frankish kingdom was not stored in its armies or its fortifications. It was stored in gold, in silver, in the treasure of the church, and the tribute of 1,000 estates. And treasure, unlike courage, can be carried away in a ship. The Seine was the highway that made all of this possible. A liquid road running from the cold northern seas straight into the soft, rich belly of the Frankish heartland. Every bend in the river revealed another monastery, another town, another pile of wealth guarded by men who had never learned to fight for their own survival. But this raid was not a quick hit on a coastal village. This was something bigger, bolder, more terrifying in its ambition. The Vikings had come to take Paris itself, the greatest city in Western Europe, the seat of the emperor's power, the jewel that every chronicler in Christendom knew by name. And they had come at the worst possible moment. The king was away, dealing with troubles in another corner of his fracturing realm. The city's garrison was thin, its walls old, its defenders uncertain. The raiders knew this. They had planned for it. Their timing was not luck, it was intelligence. Imagine planning a move for months, watching your target, learning its rhythms, waiting for the exact day when the guard changes and the gate stands open. That is what the Vikings did to Paris. They did not stumble into this opportunity. They built it sail by sail, mile by mile. So on that Easter Monday, when the fleet rounded the last bend and Paris came into view, the Vikings smelled victory. They could already taste the wine in the cellars, feel the weight of the silver in the churches, hear the screams that would fill the narrow streets. For them, this was the greatest prize of their generation. But Paris was not a village. Paris was a fortress, and fortresses do not fall in a day. The defenders barred the gates, manned the walls, and sent riders racing south to find the king. The siege had begun, and neither side yet understood what they were in for. The first assault came at the river. The Vikings dragged smaller boats into position, launched rafts of burning timber toward the city's waterfront, and filled the air with arrows that fell like rain on the battlements. You could smell the pitch before you saw the flames, sharp and bitter, mixed with the smoke of 100 fires. The defenders answered with everything they had. Stones rained down from the walls, boiling oil poured from cauldrons, hissing as it met the cold river air. Men screamed on both sides, and the water turned red before the sun had climbed past its zenith. But here is the thing nobody tells you about the Vikings. They were not mindless barbarians who wanted to burn everything and die for glory. They were professionals. And like all professionals, they knew that the best way to take a city was not to smash its walls, but to break its will. So they pulled back. They let the fires burn down. They let the corpses float past the city walls, a daily reminder of what awaited if the defenders held out too long. And they began to build. Not siege towers, not yet. Something far more patient, far more cunning, far more frightening to a city that had never seen its like. They built their camp on an island in the river, a natural fortress that no Frankish army could reach without boats. From that island, they could cut off the city's supply lines, watch the gates day and night, and wait. Time was their weapon, and time, they knew, was the one thing the Franks did not have. Inside the walls, the mood shifted from defiance to dread. The defenders had thrown back the first assault, but the cost was high, and the raiders showed no sign of leaving. Every morning, the sentries looked out at the island camp and saw more ships arriving. Every night, they heard the drums and the horns, the sounds of a war machine that was just warming up. The city's leaders gathered in the great hall and argued. Some demanded a desperate breakout, a charge through the gates and into the enemy camp. Others spoke of negotiating, of offering silver to make the raiders go away. And a few, the quiet ones, the ones who had seen the fleet with their own eyes, whispered the word that no king wants to hear: surrender. Here is a question for you. If you knew that paying a bully would make the beating stop, would you pay? Even if you knew that the bully would come back next year, stronger, hungrier, more confident. Even if you knew that every coin you handed over was a confession of weakness. If that question is still rattling around in your skull, would you pay the bully or stand and take the beating? Then you're already deeper inside this trap than most people will ever admit. That's exactly the kind of hard, ugly decision we pick apart on this channel. And subscribing means you'll be right here when the next empire learns the same brutal lesson the hard way. Drop one word in the comments, pay the Danegeld or hold the wall. Let's see how many of us would have survived the Viking winter. That is the trap the Franks were about to step into. The trap that history would come to know as Danegeld. The payment was not just a ransom, it was a lesson, and the Vikings were very, very good teachers. They taught it through fire. They sent raiding parties up and down the Seine, burning every village that refused to pay them tribute, showing the Franks that resistance meant annihilation and cooperation meant survival. They taught it through famine, cutting off the roads so that no grain could reach the city's granaries. They taught it through despair, letting the bodies pile up in the river until the water itself began to stink. And then they waited for the city's nerve to break. They did not have to storm the walls. They just had to make the people inside understand that the walls could not save them. That was the genius of their strategy. And it was working. You have felt this. If you have ever been stuck in a bad situation with no clear exit, the slow crawl of fear that turns into exhaustion, then into a desperate need for any solution, no matter how humiliating. That is what was happening inside Paris in the spring of 845. The defenders were not cowards. They held the walls. They fought the raiders every time the boats came close. They buried their dead in the churchyards and kept the fires burning on the ramparts, night after night. But courage alone does not fill a starving belly, and courage alone does not pay for the food that never comes. The riders had reached the king. The word was spreading through the Frankish court that Paris was under siege, that the river was lost, that the city could not hold much longer. And the king, Charles the Bald, grandson of the great Charlemagne, faced a decision that would define his reign. He could march north with every soldier he could muster, risk a catastrophic battle against an enemy who had never lost a major engagement on the river, and gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. Or he could do what the Vikings expected him to do, what every wealthy kingdom had done when faced with these northern wolves. He could pay them, and if he paid them, he would save the city. He would spare his people the horror of a sack. He would preserve his army for the other wars that always seemed to be waiting just around the corner. But he would also set a precedent that would echo down the centuries. The chronicles record that the king chose to negotiate, and the price that was agreed upon was staggering: 7,000 livres of gold and silver, a fortune so vast that it took days to weigh, to count, to load onto the Viking ships. In modern terms, try to imagine a sum so large it would take a lifetime of wages to earn, handed over in a single afternoon. This was not a token payment. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was the entire treasury of a kingdom, stripped of its wealth to buy back a single city. And the Vikings took it. They counted every coin, weighed every bar, and then they did what they had promised to do. They left. The ships slipped back down the river, heavy with silver, their dragon prows pointing toward the sea. And Paris, bruised and starving, began the slow work of burying its dead and rebuilding its walls. The siege was over. The city had survived, and history would record it as a kind of triumph. But it was not a triumph. It was a purchase, a short-term fix that came with a mortgage on the future. And everyone who had watched the ships depart knew it. The Vikings had not been defeated. They had been paid. And payment, unlike a lesson learned in blood, does not teach an enemy to stay away. Have you ever bought peace? Paid a bill just to make the phone stop ringing? Or given in to an argument to end the fight, even though you knew the same fight would come back next month? That is political, human, and terrible. That is what happened here. The word that would come to describe this was coined by the people who lived through its consequences: Danegeld, literally the Danes' payment. And the name stuck because the practice did too. The payment of 845 was not the ransom to end all ransoms. It was just the beginning. Over the next several decades, the Franks and their neighbors would pay similar tributes again and again, a dozen times or more, until the payment itself became a kind of tax, a budget line item, a grim expectation. The Vikings learned that they did not have to conquer a kingdom to strip it bare. They only had to threaten it. The threat was enough. And here is the darkest irony of all. The silver that the Franks paid to buy their safety was forged into coins that the Vikings carried back to their homelands. And those coins, those Frankish marks of shame, became the currency of a new age. They funded more fleets, more raids, more Danegeld. The wealth of one kingdom became the war chest of its enemies. But the story does not end with silver and ships. It ends with something far more lasting, far more surprising. The Franks, humiliated and drained, did not simply accept their fate. They learned from their enemies, and what they learned would eventually terrify the Vikings as much as the Vikings had terrified Paris. The city that paid the Danegeld in 845 would be besieged again. But the men who defended it the second time were a different breed. They had watched the raiders, studied their tactics, understood their hunger, and they built something new in response, something that would change the balance of power forever. But that is a story for another day. For now, stand with me on the banks of the Seine in that spring of long ago, and watch the last sail disappear around the bend. The silver is gone. The city breathes again. And a king, who could have been a conqueror, walks back to his hall with the weight of what he has done pressing down on his shoulders. Charles the Bald did not die in the siege. He did not lose his crown. He did not even lose his reputation, at least not immediately. In the chronicles of his reign, the payment is recorded not as surrender, but as strategy, a wise king choosing to preserve his strength for the battles that truly mattered. The chronicles call it strategy, a wise king preserving his strength. But you felt the hollow echo in that word, didn't you? Subscribe now, because the next time Paris faces those dragon ships, everything changes, and you're going to want to see what they built in response. Drop one word in the comments that sums up what that Danegeld really purchased, because I know you saw the same weakness I did. But you and I know the truth. The records, read closely, tell a different story. The payment was not a strategy. It was a symptom of a kingdom that had grown rich and soft, mighty in name, but hollow in purpose, a giant whose shadow still made small men tremble, but whose bones had begun to weaken. And the Vikings, they took the silver, loaded it onto their ships, and sailed away richer than any king in the north. The scale of the payment was so enormous that the treasure they carried home could be divided among the crew in shares that made every raider a wealthy man. This is why they had come. This is why they would come again. The Danegeld of 845 did not end the Viking threat. It exported it, refined it, made it more efficient. Every kingdom in Europe that watched Paris hand over its silver learned a lesson, and none of those lessons was about courage or defiance. The lesson was about leverage. The lesson was about fear. The lesson was about what happens when the people with the gold meet the people with the swords. And yet, if you look closely at the years that followed, there is another lesson hidden in the records. The Franks did not stop fighting. They did not fall into despair. They began to build, to fortify, to organize. They started constructing the castles that would dot the French countryside for centuries, stone by stone, a response to the terror that had flowed up the Seine. Those castles became the symbol of the age that followed, the age of feudalism, the age of the vassal and the fiefdom, the age when every lord on the river built his own walls, hired his own soldiers, and swore his own oath to resist the wolves at the gate. The Danegeld had bought time, and in that time, The Franks built the fortress world that would eventually make the Viking raids obsolete. Think about that when you next see a castle, when you walk through its gates, or run your hand along its cold stone walls. Every one of those stones is a monument to a failure that became a lesson, a payment that became a foundation, a humiliation that became the seed of something stronger. So when you hear the word Danegeld, do not think of a bribe. Think of a turning point. Think of the moment when a rich kingdom understood that its wealth was a target and began the long, painful work of building something worth defending. The silver was lost, but the walls rose. And in the end, the walls proved more valuable than all the gold in Paris. The sails are gone now, over the horizon, carrying their precious cargo toward the cold northern seas. The city stands, battered but alive, its people already beginning the slow work of tomorrow. And you, standing on the bank with me, have seen what the textbooks never show you. This was not a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of choices. Choices made in fear, in greed, in hope, in exhaustion. Choices that built a future that neither side could have imagined on that spring morning when the mist burned off the river and the dragon prows came into view. The vrai scale of the siege was never the ships, or the silver, or the walls. The true scale was the shadow it cast forward, over a century of raids and payments, over the castles that rose in response, over the new world that was being born from the wreckage of the old. That is the story you have been missing. And the next time you read a headline about someone paying to make a threat go away, remember Paris. Remember the silver. Remember the lesson that was learned too slowly, at too great a cost, by people who had no idea that their moment of weakness would echo for 1,000 years.